Together, we will make America great again.
Trump's new presidency marks a pivotal chapter in U.S. history, bringing bold shifts in domestic priorities and global strategy. This era is defined by a renewed focus on economic growth, immigration reform, and a recalibrated foreign policy. With its far-reaching implications, this presidency is set to redefine America's position on the global stage, reshaping alliances, trade, and power dynamics. How are domestic and international policies intertwined in Trump's second presidency? What evolving priorities are reshaping U.S. strategies at home and abroad? And what do these changes mean for the Middle East?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Sabah al-khair, excellencies and distinguished panel of experts and esteemed guests. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the ECSSR today for our symposium, Trump 2.0, Redefining Domestic Priorities and Global Strategy. And actually, I just tell our distinguished panelists that this symposium is like a trap, because it is too hard to predict what is going to come to the new administration. So in the near future, there will be a new administration in the White House, and all over the world are waiting for the outcome of this administrations. Many questions are raised. We've seen it in the video, and I think there is another questions are raised about Trump administration toward many problems and conflicts all over the world, given what happened in Ukraine and Russia, Middle East, and also in the Far East. So all this question is it is really hard to be answered, but I'm quite sure that we have a very distinguished panelists here today. They are a very distinguished in their field, experts, and their expertise for sure it will help us to find at least some answers for these questions. I hope you all enjoying this symposium, and I'm quite sure that the insight which has come from our expert, it will give us a very clear picture for what upcoming to this administration's. U.S. is very important for all over the world, and we have to deal with the new administration, with the new ideas that comes, or Trump will bring some of his thought when he was a president and 4 years ago. So we'll see what our experts will give us today. So I hope you all the best, and I'm waiting, like my colleagues, to see and hear from your side. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your introduction. Esteemed guests and colleagues, good morning, and thank you for joining us at the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research. We are delighted to welcome you to today's symposium titled Trump 2.0, Redefining Domestic Priorities and Global Strategy. I am Sagar Naimi, a researcher at the ECSSR, and I'm honored to be moderating the first session of this symposium titled Trump's Evolving Foreign Policy in a Shifting Global Landscape. Our conversation will be centered on four main themes. First, from polarization to realignment, how the local affects the global. Second, structural transformations of the global order. Third, China at a crossroads. And finally, ASEAN in the eye of the storm. We are privileged today to be joined by a group of distinguished scholars and speakers. We have with us today Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, who is the former Indian ambassador to Jordan, Libya, and Malta, as well as the former Director General for the Gulf and Hajj divisions in the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi. The ambassador is currently a distinguished fellow at the Vivekananda International Foundation. Second, we have Dr. Seth Maskett, who is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center on American Politics at the University of Denver. Among his publications are No Middle Ground, How Informal Party Organizations Control Nominations and Polarized Legislatures in 2009, The Inevitable Party, Why Attempts to Kill the Party System Fail and How They Weaken Democracy in 2016, as well as a book on political parties in 2021. Third, we have Dr. Li Wei, who is professor at the School of International Studies at Renmin University of China and the director of the Economic Diplomacy Research Program. Professor Lee is also the participant on the initiative for US-China Dialogue on Global Issues Research Group on managing strategic competition at Georgetown University, as well as authoring a book titled Battles for International Institutions, the Sino-US in the Era of Strategic Competition in 2017. And finally, we have Ms. Bhagyashree Garikar, currently the U.S. Bureau Chief at the Straits Times of Singapore and formerly the U.S. correspondent during the Bush and Obama administrations. She is also a Jefferson Fellow. This session will be held in a discussion format between myself and our 4 speakers for the first 40 minutes, and there will be 2 rounds of questioning. Typically, each speaker will deliver their remarks in 4 minutes, and then the floor will be open to the audience for the last 20 minutes of the session. I kindly ask our audience to prepare their questions as the session is underway, as we will be taking the questions in one batch at the end. To begin, I'd like to thank our distinguished speakers again. Let me start with you, Professor Maskett. We are witnessing, as you mentioned in a recent article in the Dispatch, a historic realignment within the American electorate. After years of discussing polarization within American society, we saw that President-elect Trump has swept through almost every demographic: young men, married women, black men, Latinos of both genders, as well as Arab and Muslim Americans, aside from strengthening his grip on the working class. What emerged is a multiracial, multi-class coalition of the sort that Democrats once prided themselves on building, and Republicans now claiming that they have evolved into a working class party. So my question is, how will these transformations in the domestic sphere interact with foreign policy? In particular, does it give birth to a strong non-interventionist current within institutions in DC? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you all for this very generous invitation. I would agree with the question. There really has been a very important shift underway within U.S. politics. In some ways, there was simply an overall shift in the direction of the Republican Party, of which Donald Trump is a member, but within that, we have seen some important shifts going on, with the Republican Party becoming, as you say, more multiracial, more emphasizing people without a college education, while those with a college education have moved more toward the Democratic Party. What we've seen over the past few years in the U.S., and particularly within the Republican Party, is a takeover of that party by what we might call a conservative populist wing. This has been occurring in a number of democracies, particularly in Europe, but this has been a trend within the U.S. over the past 3 decades, roughly, starting with Pat Buchanan's presidential campaigns in the 1990s, through the Tea Party movement in the 2000s, and since 2016 with Donald Trump. These populists have essentially several things in common. A fierce opposition to immigration within the U.S., particularly from the U.S.'s southern border. A somewhat conspiratorial worldview, seeing a set of elites, cultural elites, media, academic elites as steering systems against the need of quote-unquote regular Americans. An opposition to existing institutions, conventions and norms, distrust of expertise, and what we sometimes call an America First orientation, with high tariffs to limit foreign trade, to promote American industry and manufacture. This populist viewpoint has existed for some time. It's often been fairly dismissed by both parties. It is now in control of a major political party in the U.S., and that party will have control of the White House and the Congress in about a month. The consequences of this, even in foreign policy, I think are pretty profound. Interestingly, in foreign policy, this is one of the few areas where there's still significant dissent within the Republican Party. Senator Marco Rubio, who will soon be the Secretary of State, he's actually a somewhat rare figure in U.S. in that he was an established Republican senator before Donald Trump's rise. He was a part of what we might call the old Reagan-Bush coalition, advocating more aggressive U.S. foreign policy, favoring democracy, open markets, and so forth. He has changed his stances somewhat as his party has, but he's remained at least a somewhat internationalist, favoring support for Ukraine, for example. Senator Lindsey Graham and other Republicans have a similar outlook. They probably won't directly challenge Trump all that much, but they still retain some influence within their party. Otherwise, we're likely to see a substantial retrenchment of a lot of U.S. military commitments, especially with regards to Ukraine. We'll likely see increasing rifts within the NATO coalition. I very much doubt the U.S. will actually withdraw from NATO, but Trump will continue to try to fray some of those commitments and to cause some sort of dissent within the ranks there. Trump will likely seek to undermine a number of trade agreements, including the USMCA or NAFTA. Will seek to ramp up tariffs with many nations. He's been pushing away really from the bipartisan post-Cold War consensus on free trade, and along those lines is likely to continue the trade war he sort of initiated with China in his first term, keeping tariffs high, quite possibly raising those tariffs even further. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Ambassador, the international system has witnessed fundamental structural transformations. Some might call them repeated strains since 2016, including but not limited to the return of history in Europe with the Russian-Ukrainian war, the cementing of the US-China rivalry, and the rising tensions in the Middle East, as well as questions about the integrity of the global economic system with the trade war and swift cutting off Russia. In sum, increased global anarchy. As such, how will the incoming Trump administration interact with this new landscape? Should we expect an aggressive approach, like his first term, or one more focused on retrenchment and containment? And what will be his attitude towards alliances, building off Professor Maskett, particularly NATO? What does the future of the European security order, including the resolution of the current conflict in Ukraine, look like? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and I would like to express my gratitude to His Excellency and the ECSSR for inviting me again. I fully agree with you that there is a return of the history. I think Fukuyama was a bit too early in telling that there's an end of history. But what has happened now is that these two wars have changed the complex to a great extent. And the unilateralism has become the norm, be it by the United States, Russia, China, or even for that matter, the middle powers. There is a complete defiance of the international order, international law. So nobody knows whether we are into this, from this transition, where we are going to head. So we are seeing the geopolitical, geoeconomic, and the geo-religious as well as geotechnological contestation taking place in all geographies. What is this particular Russia-Ukraine war has taught us is the major focus on these 4 Fs. The weaponization of financial instruments by the United States and the West, which led to the weaponization of food, fertilizer, and fuel. And that is what is impacting. And now President Trump, as you know, recently declared that 100% tariffs he will put on BRICS countries if we go in for de-dollarization and other things. I have written about it. And I say, you must look inside. What led to it? What is leading to it? So if you yourself are not following the order, the rules of the game that you yourself have drafted or crafted, then obviously we are looking at a very difficult situation. So today we are looking at the 4 Ds also, which is like disruption, defiance, disorder, and destruction. That's happening in our neighborhood also. Trump's only thing I always say is that he may be a bully, but he is not a warmonger. He treats friends and foes alike. We've seen his statements. He's also, in a way, you're seeing what is happening in Germany and what is happening in Canada and Mexico and elsewhere. So you can put him, define him like this, the way it is going to. The disruptor, he defies logic, dead against the deep state. So the deep state is generally attributed in the US to a lot of problems outside. So he's against that this time because he learned from the first one. Doesn't like wars, and he considers himself to be a great deal maker. So everywhere he will be trying to do the deals rather than going in for wars. Tariffs have become his very favorite tool, and that's what we are going to live. He believes that the personality has a power. And this time he does not have the kind of people who were well entrenched in the system before. So we might see that there could be a certain amount of pragmatism, and certain predictability in his behavior, in his approaches, in his policies. So we need to brace against certain things which he has already said. At the same time, we'll have to be, what McMaster said is that his reflexively contrarian approach. I mean, that is something that we will need to look at and work on this. As far as his relationship with various countries are concerned, I think that, like what he did recently, I was just mentioning that inviting President Xi Jinping to his coronation, that is out of this. Nobody thought that he will do that. He goes and hugs North Korean leader. That was, nobody expected that. He took him to South Korean side or went to the North Korean. So he is capable of thinking out of the box in a way. And there is certain kind of a method in his madness. So for me today, that we are infested with all these major destructive wars, if he is able to put them back in the box somehow, I think that will be, then you are looking at a more constructive world order in which we are going to move. And I think that Trump will be moving in a way that would be engaging with the world. While he does not want, for him, America first, make America great again, make America work again, those are going to be the things in which immigration is going to be a major problem, in which has a direct repercussion for many countries in the world. And also, we will have his tariff, which is trade wars, are very likely to happen, or at least he will hope that he can use these as a negotiating tool. So we are in it for a mixed bag. As Excellency, you mentioned, that it's difficult to predict. It's a trap, but I would hope, as a diplomat, former diplomat, that he will be more pragmatic this time.
We're all hoping so, Ambassador. Thank you for your remarks. Professor Lee, as we enter a new age of heightened strategic rivalry, global economic governance is increasingly strained. The incoming Trump administration, both in the president's rhetoric and the substance of his appointees, intends to take trade restrictions to a new level in a bid to revive American industry. Other countries in the developed world show signs of following the same path. What is China's contingency plan in dealing with this changed global environment? Does economic diplomacy between the great powers still have a chance? And what are the possible areas of cooperation that might entice Trump to seek a deal, and the areas that are irrevocably sundered apart?
Thanks very much to the moderator, and thanks very much for your kind invitation. It's my first time here. Very fantastic country and city. Regarding your questions, how China will do, how China will respond in face of the coming of the Trump's great pressure. That's a very important question. One word to answer the question: open, keep open, and sustain and become more open. Trump has threatened to impose 60% tariffs on China. That's very terrible thing. So what China should do? In my personal view, we should not do the tit for tat. We can do some symbolic actions to satisfy our domestic audience, but that's not our main strategy. Our strategy should be to take more open policies. And in this process, the economic diplomacy, of course, play a very important role. First, we would like to cooperate with our Asia-Pacific countries to proceed the RCEP, which is the largest free trade agreement in the developing countries. And also, we will apply for the CPTPP. This is another important free trade agreement led by Japan. It's a high-level free trade agreement. Previously, it was TPP, led by the United States. After the Trump got into the White House, the U.S. has withdrawn from TPP. Now it become the CPTPP. It's very high level. Now China is applying for the membership of this high-level free trade agreement. And at the same time, we are negotiating the FTA free trade agreement with Middle East countries, the the Gulf, the Gulf Cooperation Council. We hope we can finish this FTA with Gulf Cooperation Council in the near future. So, in sum, we will make use of the openness policy to counter against the United States protectionism. In China, I can tell you, we are discussing about the unilateral openness. To take more openness policy without the compromise from other countries, the unilateral openness policy. So, in the past years, China has taken the visa-free policies. These policies have been welcomed by the worldwide. So, in the future, we will take more and more such policies, such open policies to counter against the U.S. trade protectionism. The second question is concerning which area we can cooperate with the United States. In my view, we can cooperate to deal with the U.S. trade surplus. Isn't that right? Surplus. That's right. We have 300 billion trade surplus. With U.S. has 300 trade surplus with China. And that's a big problem, I think. So we are willing to deal with this problem by negotiation rather than trade war. So what we can buy from the United States in the future? The first one is agricultural goods. Before the trade war, we buy 20 billion agricultural goods from the United States. In the future, we can double it. The second, we can lift the access limit to the Boeing aircraft because of the MAX event. Maybe you know that. We have banned the access to purchase the Boeing. We have in the past 5 years, we have bought very much Airbus, but no Boeing. But if we can keep peace and negotiate, we can buy more Boeing aircraft. More important, we are developing our own commercial aircraft industry. So we need more aircraft engine from GE, General Electric. Also deal with this issue, China cannot do alone. It depends on the U.S. technology export policy. We need more chips, but the U.S. has cut the limit, has cut the access of China's buying the chips. So, in sum, we have several structural contradictions between China and the United States. But regarding the trade surplus issues, China is constructive. We are ready to deal with these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Ms. Garikar, ASEAN has emerged as the epicenter of US-China strategic competition this past decade and will probably remain so over the course of the following decades, much like the Middle East in the 20th century. Over the past year, we have seen heightened tensions in the South China Sea, especially between the Philippines and China, with escalating violence becoming a norm rather than the exception. The delicate balancing act that ASEAN, both as a bloc and as individual countries, has been attempting to maintain between Washington and Beijing is a fervent point of discussion in policymaking circles, with questions being raised about its sustainability. In your view, can ASEAN as a bloc remain united in the hardening competition between the great powers, or will specific countries defect, if that is the right term, to either Beijing or Washington over the long term? Will nervousness towards Beijing drive maritime ASEAN countries towards Washington, whilst their counterparts in the mainland seek to accommodate it and profit from strengthened economic ties? Thank you.
Morning, everyone. And thank you very much for this invitation to be part of this very exciting discussion. And thank you to my hosts for your wonderful hospitality. I think to everyone in the audience who's wondering why the fuss with ASEAN, well, thank you first of all for, for the attention to ASEAN. So I thought I could give you a very quick introduction to what ASEAN is about. So we are 10 Southeast Asian countries and soon to be 11 members of ASEAN once East Timor comes in, as it might in the coming year. Our combined population would be around 700 million people, and our GDP would be around 3.67 trillion, which is like, well, the US would be around 30 trillion to compare with, and China maybe about 17 trillion. So that's what we are in terms of size. We have a very fast-growing region as well. So that probably is the reason that there is a lot of interest here. I think like this part of the world, we're also on a very important trading route. All the crude and natural gas and things that are exported from here pass by, Southeast Asia, Singapore, through the Strait of Malacca on its way to China, Korea, Japan, and so on. So we've been important for a long time, and I guess we are, I can put it this way, we have a lot of interest shown in us from both US and China for the longest time as well. Since the Second World War, we have a lot of investment from the US. In fact, the combined investment from the US in Southeast Asia is about, I think, around $500 billion. In Southeast Asia alone, US invests more than it has invested in China, in Korea, Japan, India combined. I think it's almost double that investment. So this is where that region stands. And ASEAN is, as you know, was founded in 1967. So it's 57th year now. Your question is valid. Does it remain united and relevant when there is such a push and pull between US and China? I think it will remain relevant and united, mainly because it needs to. While we entertain attention from both US and China, we also want to be part of what's going on. And ASEAN as a body is a very, although as a body it's very loosely affiliated, it's a very good mechanism for interacting, because we are not, say like you, very bound. We are very, very loosely affiliated. That means that we have the flexibility. And individual members of the ASEAN are very aware that they need to be pragmatic. Now, if you follow the news reports, at different points in ASEAN's history, nations have been perhaps pulled a little more towards China. That is natural, because China has, as China becomes the #1 trading partner for each of the countries in ASEAN, it's an outcome that can be expected. But I'm pretty pragmatic and hopeful that it will be able to navigate this push and pull quite easily. I think as much as we see in this region, which also has overtures from both parties. It's been the case for centuries, and I expect it will continue. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Professor Maskett, we've heard from our speakers very important geoeconomic themes. So let me pull you back to the American tradition. Will the American political realignment that we talked about in the first round of questions, on the long term, pull Republicans back to the Hamiltonian American system, which is currently espoused by Vice President Vance and Secretary Rubio, and promoted by their affiliates at the American Compass think tank? What implications do these local shifts have on the world?
Thank you for that question. So, given your question, given what I was talking about earlier in terms of Donald Trump's populist conservative orientation, he seems interested in pulling back the U.S. from many of its international commitments. The long post-Cold War consensus of the U.S. being the indispensable nation, or the so-called tradition of American exceptionalism, it appears to be at an end. It's notable that over the past decade or so, both major parties in the U.S., the Democrats and the Republicans, have become something like anti-war parties. Not that they're explicitly pacifist or anything like that, but there's just no real constituency for major U.S. military roles abroad. I think partially this is a result of the experience of President George W. Bush and the war with Iraq and the so-called war on terror. As the public soured on that conflict, it was seen as costing Republicans control of Congress and control of the presidency in 2006 and 2008. Republicans turned against it. Democrats portrayed it as an example of American hubris. Americans will still provide some financial support for Ukraine, to Israel to some extent, but otherwise this support is very limited. I think also importantly, while the U.S. foreign policy is generally focused on what is often called American exceptionalism, the idea that the U.S. is advocating some set of ideals regarding democracy and free markets, this simply does not appear to be a priority for Donald Trump. He's openly favored, quote unquote, strong men like Orban, Putin, Kim Jong-un. That said, as some speakers have noted here, Trump is not terribly ideological. He has made exceptions to his worldview in the past, offering to exempt some nations he does business with from a travel ban. Nations that win his favor or impress him as being vital to business are likely to get exemptions from some of his most aggressive tariffs and other things. He's a highly transactional politician. He's been willing to work with some nations on some issues to get concessions that are often only tenuously related to the issue at hand. It's also my impression that the Abraham Accords remain something he's very proud of from his first term, and he wishes to expand on, inviting other Middle Eastern nations to normalize relations with Israel. This is obviously a challenging environment for that to happen, given Israel's current policies, but Trump is close with the Israeli administration, and we may see something along these lines. It's said that, there's a phrase that power abhors a vacuum. The U.S. withdrawing from this and other regions, even if slowly, does create something of a vacuum. Nations willing to make some investment in promoting business, supporting peace efforts, and so forth, and have the resources to do it, can be expanding their influence in this political environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Ambassador, let's talk about something important, which we have not yet touched upon. Given your expertise, what role should middle powers play in this emerging order or disorder?
Thank you. In fact, as we know that, I mean, in my view, might be wrong totally, that we are eventually heading towards a Cold War 2.0, depending on what kind of outcome we see for the Russia-Ukraine war, unless it turns into a hot war. Let's hope it doesn't. Then, but this would be very different than the Cold War 1.0. This time, we will see geopolitically, there may be Cold War 2.0 playing out, but then geoeconomically, you will have many more actors. And that's where the bigger role for the middle powers comes in. And in my view, I mean, what India follows, I can only talk about it. It has paid us dividends, not from now, but for the last 60, 70 years. That is, we must follow this policy as middle powers. Number one, we should not get caught into wars and conflicts. So that way, what is happening in this region needs to be worked upon by various powers. Like, for example, UAE follows this no-problem policy with anybody. So that's very important. We must show mutual respect, mutual sensitivities, and identify mutual interests by the middle powers. And in that kind of a scenario, while we are waiting and watching, most important thing is for us is economic growth and development. And for that, it is important that we follow a certain policy called strategic autonomy, which most of our countries are doing it in the region. And that is something that will pay good dividends. You can negotiate your interests, because at the end of the day, the interest of every foreign policy is to serve its own national interest. And that can only happen if there is peace, and then only development can take place. So we need to work towards that as far as we can play a role. Rather than, and also it is very important that we try to help in the reglobalization effort, because what we are going to witness more and more is protectionism, whether it is in trade or otherwise, and all that will have to be addressed by constant engagement. And that will be very, very essential in my view. For us, in the Middle East region, We have I2U2, which is an extremely important tool. We are talking of the IMEC, which is another. India and UAE are continuing to follow on that. We have IUSU, India, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and USA. That is an extremely important, India GCC, and GCC itself, like most countries, are engaging with them. So we have several middle powers in this region itself. And therefore, this, and I always believe that for India, it is extremely important that security and stability in the Middle East remains. And for that, we need to work together. But the moment you start looking at for your security architecture to be dictated from outside, then you are looking for trouble. And for that, it is also imperative that the historic issues must be resolved through a common understanding and effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. To build off our discussion on middle powers, Professor Lee, as the Global South's importance to Beijing increases in such a changing environment, how will China's geo-economic ties with the Global South play a role in its grand strategy as increasing parts of the world are sealed off to Chinese goods and influence? Thank you.
Thank you. Very significant questions. We will, in the future, we will strengthen our economic ties with the Global South countries. I have mentioned that we will further promote the free trade agreement negotiation with developing countries, including Middle East countries. So, in the context of the rising of trade and investment protectionism in the world, China will definitely promote more open policies collaborated with our Global South countries. But we know that free trade will not automatically bring about economic growth and social development. We know that, and we admitted that. So we initiated the One Belt, One Road initiative. That's Chinese experiences in the past 4 decades. We have a very old saying: if you want to get rich, build the road first. That's our experience for the economic development. So we hope to share the experiences with our developing country, the friends from the developing countries. That's why we propose the BRI, Belt and the Road initiatives. So in the future, we will continue to make use of the BRI to strengthen our economic ties with the Global South countries. We hope to get together. We hope to modernize our economies together. So that's my answer. Yeah.
Just a follow-up question, Professor. In previous discussions with the Chinese academics, we learned that there are currently discussions in Beijing, both in academic and official circles, of potentially increasing security and military commitments abroad. What is your impression of this discussion? In 1 minute, please.
Okay. I teach international political economy in my university. I'm not a military expert on, so maybe I have no accurate answers to your questions. But I would like to say, from 1979, that's the last war China waged against Vietnam. That's the last war we launched. So in the past more than 4 decades, China never waged any war with any country. Yes, we have several minor conflicts with our neighbors. That's very minor conflicts. We try to solve them by peace. So I think China's influence abroad is on economic side, not on military side.
Thank you, Professor. Ms. Garikawa, what is the view from Washington towards ASEAN, both as countries and a bloc, and its role in the fracturing world order?
Washington actually pays Southeast Asia a lot of importance. Under Biden, as you might have noticed, there were a lot of initiatives which were aimed at making Southeast Asia and that larger Indo-Pacific part of the world a partner for the US. Amid, of course, rising prominence of China as a geostrategic actor. And we expect that to continue. There is this concept called ASEAN centrality, you may have heard of it, which is that in the 10 ASEAN nations, when the outside powers look at us, we want agency. If there are important security or any political or economic initiatives that are happening, they should happen with ASEAN in the driver's seat, so to speak. So this is how ASEAN sort of conceives itself. I expect that will continue. I expect Washington will continue to pay ASEAN that kind of attention in that framework. ASEAN's biggest demand is that the US especially should have a better way of engaging the region economically. So for instance, RCEP and the CPTPP, which Professor Lee just mentioned, those are two important trading pacts for the region in which United States is not a member. So as we know, Trump pulled out of TPP, I think the third day after he came to office. And RCEP has China, does not have the US. It is among the leading trading pacts in the world. So the economic component of it has to come forth better. That hasn't happened so far. We'd like to see what happens under Trump. From what Trump says, we know that he pays attention to surpluses, trade surpluses. And ASEAN as a whole it does trade to the region of around $500 billion worth of trade between US and ASEAN. And the surplus is about $200 billion. So it might be the case that after Trump finishes dealing with China and all that, and if he looks at us, then there is that in some countries, for instance, Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, a lot of them have big trade surpluses with the US. And I think as Dr. Lee was suggesting, there are ways to get that to be a little more balanced. The reason why we had this big accumulating surplus is because as US started to become, started to be scrutinizing the trade between China and the US, many of these industries, as you would know, shifted to Vietnam, to Malaysia, to Thailand, to Singapore. So this is the reason that there is now more export going from there because, you don't want your goods tariffed from China. You can have them, ship them out from Vietnam. You can move your factories to Vietnam. That leads to rising surplus. But then there are ways to get around it, including buying US defense equipment, for one thing. But one thing that ASEAN probably wishes that it gets out of the US more than anything else, that would be some kind of agreement around digital trade. So digital economy is the big thing now. I mean, trade in goods is one thing, and of course, it is what it is. But services, and especially digital part of it, that is growing in importance. Within ASEAN, as you might know, we are negotiating a free trade agreement. By end of 2025, we should have a free trade agreement in digital economy. And it would be fantastic if Trump decides to be part of it. In his first term, he did have a digital free trade agreement with Japan. So I guess I would say that our expectation remains that it might happen.
Thank you very much. And my final question is to Professor Lee on the technological sphere. Given your expertise in the areas of semiconductors and aviation, will we perhaps see a technologically polarized and divided world? And what are the downstream political effects of such a world on third countries?
Technology issue is very difficult. Before I answer your difficult questions, I would like to make some quick supplement on your first question. What China can buy from the United States to address the trade deficit? Very quick supplement. besides for the agricultural goods, aircrafts, and some high-tech goods, we are considering about to buy more gas and oil from the United States. We know that Trump preferred the traditional energy, not the clean energy. So we are considering about to buy more the traditional energies from the United States. But it depends on the price, whether the price is favorable, particularly comparing with the Middle East countries. More than that, we are considering about buy more surfaces to open the Chinese services market to the United States, particularly in the areas such as education and tourism. The market potential for Chinese students studying in the United States and for Chinese tourists visiting the United States is immense. But whether such potential can be realized depends on the U.S. visa policies. We know that the United States will take more severe visa policies toward the world, especially on China. So I'm a little optimistic for the China-U.S. trade surface trade. That's the supplement. Regarding your questions on the technology issues, which is regarding the possible scenario of the parallel technology system or the technologically divided the world. I think this is a very terrible scenario for the world. Technology globalization is one of the significant parts of the whole economic globalization. Every country, every people benefits very much from the technology globalization. For example, the iPhone. Previously, before the trade war between China and the United States, the iPhone, 95% iPhone was built was produced in China, because China has the most the best supply chain in the world. And also for the aircrafts, we use the aircraft as an example. The most developed, the most advanced, the Boeing 787, and this is the most advanced aircraft in the world. The U.S. just produced 35%. 30% was produced in Japan, and the other 35% was produced in other countries. So the aircraft, the most advanced aircraft, is the product of the technology and the economic globalization. So we subjectively, we do not want to see a fragmented trade system. We hope to maintain the unity of the technological system. However, considering about the technological competition between China and the United States, I'm not so optimistic. I think in some certain areas, we will witness the emergence of the parallel or divided technological system will emerge. But China do not want that. China benefits very much from the Wall Street. China benefits very much from Silicon Valley, right? So we want to be involved in the unitary technology system. We do not want the technology system divided into a China system or United States system. We do not want. But it depends on the U.S. technology policy toward China. It is not our choice. It depends on the U.S. policies. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As much as this conversation is enjoyable, unfortunately, I believe we have run out of time. As we wrap up today, I'd like to express our gratitude to our guest speakers for such a thought-provoking and fruitful discussion. And thanks to all of you for your participation. We look forward to seeing you at the second session following a short 10 to 15 minute break. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the second and last session of our symposium titled A New Era Analyzing the Implication of Policy Shifts for U.S. Engagement in the Middle East. I am Fatma Al-Karbi, a researcher at the American and European Affairs Department here at ECSSR. And it is my great pleasure to be moderating this session as we gather together to explore how would U.S.-Middle East relations play out for the coming 4 years under a second Trump administration. I now have the privilege of introducing our distinguished guest speakers who will share with us their insightful viewpoints on the current regional affairs. I'll start with my first guest, Dr. Janardhan, a director of Research and Analysis Department at Anwar Gargash Academy, and a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf State Institute in Washington. Dr. Janardhan is a prominent political analyst, author, and scholar specializing in GCC Asia relations. He is an editor and author of a number of books, of which I name two: The Arab Gulf Pivot to Asia, published in 2020, and Overcoming Smallness, The Gulf Countries as Middle Powers, which will be published this year. My second guest is Mr. Shalom Lipner, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Middle East program. Mr. Lipner is policy expert and commentator specializing in Israeli politics, U.S.-Israeli relations, and Middle East strategic affairs. He served in the Israeli Prime Minister office, where he played a key role in shaping policy and fostering diplomatic relations between Israel and its international partners. Lipner's work focuses on regional security dynamics, Israeli governance, and the evolving geopolitical landscape. His work has been featured in prominent publications, including The Atlantic and the Foreign Policy. Thank you for joining us, and I would like to mention that Dr. Ibish will not be joining us today. I'd like to first begin with asking Dr. Janardhan a broad but very pressing question on U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East. The region has been shifting over the past 14 years, becoming a theater of multiple conflicts and civil wars, with current fronts manifesting in Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen, Sudan, and the most recent developments emerging in Syria. My question concerns the security challenges resulting from these conflicts that could threaten the U.S. interest in the region in times of upheavals and instability. What criteria determines if a conflict is a priority to the United States? Are there any criteria in the first place? And if so, how do you think Trump administration consider a conflict a priority that needs to be dealt with and which will be relatively neglected?
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to the symposium. That's actually a no-brainer sort of question, right? I mean, at this point in time, the United States' priority would, of course, be Gaza. I mean, you've listed a few in terms of whether it's going to be Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Sudan. I think except Sudan, the others have a common thread linking them all. And that's addressing the Palestinian issue. And obviously, this will impact the rest. I think Israel has accomplished a fair bit of U.S.'s strategic agenda by virtue of doing what it's done over the last few months in terms of addressing, the threats in Gaza and Lebanon. And with these wins in place, I think the U.S. would not want to get into any further mess in the region. If Israel is doing it for them, why get into any sort of a mess? I think, and Trump's message when it comes to Syria has been very clear, that the U.S. has no place to be there, and it doesn't want to get involved in any of that. Houthis could be Israel's next target, depending on what they end up doing over the next few weeks or months. And Sudan is really way down the list for the United States, let alone of any interest to Israel. I don't think Israel at this point in time is really bothered about what's happening in Sudan. So all these interventions or otherwise will basically be determined by Trump's America First policy. So if you put all this together, Gaza first and last, and then everything else in between, with Sudan being really left out.
Thank you very much for your answer. What do you think, Mr. Lipner? How would Trump classify a conflict to be a priority that needs to be addressed?
Right. What do I think? First of all, I want to say thank you. Thank you to Dr. Lamy, thank you to GCSSR for hosting today. Especially since we dropped one of our panelists, I'm going to take a step back and steal some time and try and create a frame. To create a frame, and then we can sort of superimpose that on these questions. I think that, well, we're all here to sort of unlock one of the world's greatest mysteries, President Trump. There's an inherent paradox here. On the one hand, he repeatedly says, I say what I mean and I mean what I say, which is a great thing. On the other hand, he's very much established his brand as being unpredictable. So these sort of two factors are in conflict, and it makes it a little bit difficult to prognosticate what we're going to get here. I think that we see a broad, the broader frame of paradox overcome, sort of imbues a lot of what's happening here. We see, on the one hand, he and people around him as a reflection of sort of an isolationist tendency, not looking to get involved in other things in the world necessarily. America first, make America great again. On the other hand, he very much has an expansive view of being a world leader. He expects everybody to sort of step in line and, follow America's lead and do things that he wants to see fall into place. We have once again, maybe even more so this time, we have multiple appointments crashing into each other that reflect those two things. Maybe on the one hand, and my colleague Professor Muscat is right. Obviously, we see in areas of foreign policy, maybe we have more establishment figures. On the other hand, on the other side of cabinet, we have figures like Elon Musk. We have Robert Kennedy. We have all kinds of different people coming from a lot of different directions. So we're seeing sort of multiple themes in play here that could take us in a lot of different directions on all these questions. I think we have other factors that will contribute to broader turbulence throughout the administration. There's obviously this question of longevity in terms of how long people will last in these jobs. Last time he turned over principles very quickly. We can very quickly, see that happening, whether it's over issues of ego or whether disappointment with performance or stealing the limelight from him. There are lots of possibilities here for even the people that we think we know we're dealing with. We don't know how long they'll necessarily be in their jobs, what kind of freedom of activity they would necessarily have. Obviously, there are a lot of people playing around. I think the Elon Musk situation is actually particularly instructive because soon after the election already, there were stories coming out of Mar-a-Lago about how, maybe Trump was a little bit dissatisfied with how Musk was showing up in all these meetings and making, sort of throwing around his weight. And, do we really know that reflects what the president is thinking or the president-elect? Do we know that this is people in his orbit who are threatened by the fact that Musk was moving into that space? There are a lot of possibilities for why that's happening. But, we definitely do see, a landscape it's not necessarily calm. Other themes we heard about earlier today, obviously, the sort of animus for the deep state taking over and not allowing him to govern the way that he would like. And notwithstanding what we've heard, most recently, I think, heard Steve Bannon say something about it this week, but, discussion of whether or not Trump could conceivably actually run for re-election because his terms would not be consecutive. The assumption is this would be a last term. So, that combined with the fact that he holds control of the presidency and the Republicans in Congress and arguably a Supreme Court that's favorable sort of to his, ideological, worldview, creates a system where he's pretty much untethered and can do almost what he wants, whatever that turns out to be. Cheers to the specifics of your question, and we can come back to some of these themes after, I assume we will. I think that, look, ultimately, how the United States chooses to engage in the region is a function of its values and its priorities and its interests. That's just, the way American democracy functions. Obviously, they're filtered through an interpretive lens of the person in power, but that's the general sense. So we know historically that, that America is interested in its, safeguarding its forward bases in the region. We know that it's been interested in keeping energy markets open, oil markets, security of Israel, which it's repeated over time. On the flip side, relating to that, there's obviously been a concern about how we respond to elements that would threaten that, whether it's Russia or China or more locally Iran or its proxies. Anything that could sort of upset that order of priority would be something that the United States is looking on. Another factor that's interesting, and I'll get to the specifics in 1 second. Another factor that I think has been interesting is that ironically, despite the fact that we might have believed conventionally that a lot of things would not happen until after January 20th, with people sort of waiting for the new administration to come in and then operating on that level. It's been interesting to watch how, in some of the cases that I follow, people have actually engaged in some form of shuttle diplomacy between Mar-a-Lago and Washington, actually trying to talk to both administrations at the same time, and they seem to have discovered this convergence of interest where the current administration obviously wants to be able to clean its desk before January 20th and accomplish whatever legacy accomplishments it can rank up, and the Trump administration or the Trump's team seems to be amenable to that idea and has found ways to suggest that that their influence is making that difference as well. So they're able to take credit for things that happen before they take office anyway. We've seen this prominently in the case of Lebanon, where as soon as that deal was announced, Trump's incoming national security advisor said that deal happened because of President Trump. So, we have all these things happening. To the specifics, after my long introduction. Look, we've sort of seen a hierarchy of issues. He has repeatedly said that if the Gaza situation does not stabilize by January 20th, there will be hell to pay. Nobody really knows what that necessarily means. Clearly, that's something that's important to him, as it reflects the things that I raised earlier. They take pride in the fact that the Lebanese situation has stabilized to some extent. Obviously, it's not perfect. There's also a lag period that was built into that process. It wasn't going to happen overnight. It has become somewhat quieter. They will take pride in that. That, as I said, that Waltz actually said that this was because of President Trump, so there's that we're looking at. On Syria, obviously a big ticket issue evolving. Trump's initial comments on Syria were that it's not our fight. Did not want to be involved there. Certainly people in the region have a more nuanced understanding of how that could actually, yes, be the United States' fight. That continues to evolve. I'm sure we'll discuss Syria specifically later. There are obviously concerns that all parties share there. So I think the fact that he's led with not our fight does not necessarily mean the United States will disengage entirely, although the level of their engagement remains to be seen. The Houthi situation is not calming down. We had again another ballistic missile strike on Israel this week. We've seen that the Americans and the British have responded to those things. I think that will continue to be up there. And at the same time, on the flip side, not on that sort of list of hotspots, there's the positive agenda as well. I mean, the president very much wants to promote the expansion of the Abraham Accords. Some of these things will all come into class. I know we're not going. Well, we'll get into that as well. I'm just like laying it out, sort of all out there. But here too, to come full circle, paradoxes exist here as well, because making some of these things happen require effort, and it's not clear what kind of effort yet they might be willing to make. I'll leave it there and we'll continue, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you. In the same context, Dr. Janardhan, Trump's determination to stop America's endless war and achieve his America First policy goals can be interpreted by many as an emerging of a new isolationist or non-interventionist America. Given the continuous shakeups in the region, particularly with U.S. historic entanglements in the Middle East, can Trump administration create a security order that provides the flexibility to focus on containing what he described as China threat while safeguarding American interests in the region?
It's a complex question. I really don't know where to start and where to end. But let me start with highlighting a meme that I saw recently. The photo depicted a lion addressing a flock of sheep. And the caption read, "Once elected, I will become vegetarian." So all Americans who voted for Trump are indeed waiting for him to deliver on his promise. And the rest of the world is also waiting too. So I think America's first policy is firstly directed at China, no doubt. And going by President Xi's rejection of Trump's invitation for the January inauguration indicates that the battle of wits has already begun. In the economic domain, and particularly in this part of the world, we see that the US-China crossfire has impacted the UAE in particular. We've seen issues related to F-35s, 5G, the ports development, semiconductors issues. All of this means that the intersection of technology and international relations has never been as intense as it has been, and Trump will certainly pour fuel on this fire. But one thing that we need to really understand is that the world is far more multipolar than it was 4 years ago during his first term, and the Middle East today is more multi-aligned than it was 4 years ago. And it has strengthened its ties with China a fair deal, and that without undermining its ties with the United States. So if Trump 1.0 reduced US military presence in the Middle East, notably through the drawdowns in Syria and Iraq, Trump 2.0 would likely continue its America First approach with a focus on ensuring that Middle East does not get destabilized more than it has already got destabilized. But it will also want to ensure that China doesn't gain an upper hand. That would be his agenda. I think here we need to pay attention to the fact that he would also be very mindful to sort of end the free riders phenomena that he's always talked about. He did mention it even during his first term. And I think this he would try to carry out in the following ways. One, either by strengthening regional alliances, especially with Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Perhaps making them take on more responsibility for the region, because I think that was even Obama's plan much before Trump talked about America First. Obama's call was America First. And that would perhaps enable US reduce its commitments. There have been a number of formal defense arrangements that have taken place in the recent past. One, of course, is still being discussed with Saudi Arabia, but there's been the Comprehensive Security Integration and Prosperity Agreement with Bahrain in 2023, a 10-year extension of its military presence at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, which was signed earlier this year. And there's also been the granting of major defense partner status to the UAE when the UAE president visited Washington just a few months ago. I think all of these would sort of strengthen US position in the Gulf. And the aim is, of course, to try and limit China's strategic space. Number two, I think the US could also draft in other Asian countries like India, Japan, and South Korea, because there's always been this talk of sowing the seeds of a new alternative security architecture in the Indo-Pacific, because one must realize that the largest producers and the largest consumers of oil are today in Asia, and they have to think in terms of a post-US security architecture in the region, which also includes the United States. So this is not minus United States, but it also includes the United States. Could Trump promote the idea of the Quad integrating with just mentioned the Gulf and the Middle East arrangements that they have had? So there are several efforts that are being made to counter China, but the truth is that the US itself wants to wind down its presence and operations in the region, and doesn't want to get entangled after several decades of being in the region, which has earned it more enemies than friends for all the service that it has provided in the region. It now has more enemies than friends. Yet another factor that we must consider is that even the mightiest of military powers in the world are unable to decisively win wars anymore. I think that's been a fact that's been established in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Russia, and even in the Middle East in terms of the Israel war in Gaza. And we must also bear in mind that the nature of threats is also changing, because I think for a long time this part of the world was very worried about regime security, but I think the regimes here are far more secure than ever before, and their worry now is non-traditional security. They're more worried about maritime security, they're more worried about non-state actors, they're more worried about piracy, and this is not something that just the United States can, handle. Other countries which are invested in the region in terms of their trade, energy, and investment policies can also contribute to non-traditional security in the region. And this was very evident when many of the countries in the region, including regional countries and many of the US partners also, didn't join the Operation Prosperity Guardian as part of the Red Sea crisis. So this is really a catch-22 situation for Washington. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. And it's becoming very evident that the US is no longer the exclusive security player in the region that it once was. And if Trump is wise, he will really start the process of encouraging a collective security mechanism in some form, which is also the region's desire, because the region is now thinking in terms of regional solutions for regional problems. So the logic would be that a reduction of security engagement in the Middle East would lead to a power vacuum and yield space to China. I think Trump is very mindful of this. So the key challenge would be maintaining the necessary level of engagement in both regions without overstretching resources or undermining American influence in either theater, because the pivot to Asia was all about that at one point in time. And finally, I think, And it's not always going to be easy for the United States to achieve this balance, which means that Trump's policies may actually end up becoming ineffective in both Asia and Middle East. And it could end up actually strengthening China, whereas the original plan was is to basically undermine China. We must also bear in mind that China has just conducted air and naval exercises with Saudi Arabia and UAE in 2023. So it'll really be interesting, and I think I'll stop there in terms of the response. In terms of quoting somebody who once told me that it'll be interesting to watch if Trump 2.0 will be more of a reckless Twitter Trump or more of a circumspect teleprompter Trump.
Thank you, Dr. Janardar, for this comprehensive answer. Mr. Lipner, Dr. Janardar mentioned the threat of non-state actors. If we relate this to U.S. anti-terrorist role in Syria specifically, do you think, or how likely would you think that Trump would be able to pull out the 900 American troops stationed in Syria? And what would the repercussions of that be on Israel and the wider region?
And that puts together a lot of different factors. I'll try and touch on some of them. You can rein me back in if I get lost. In terms of the point of withdrawing the troops, look, I think that and this has been a thread of all the sessions, right? Clearly, his mandate and his personal interest is to be able to draw that in as much as possible. He's not looking to invest blood and treasure necessarily in the region, as notwithstanding, as I said, that maybe that comes at the expense of the leadership role that you want. So I think that he would probably like to. I don't think it'll be the first priority. It may not happen at all. He discussed it last time too when he was president, and they're still there. And much of that will be a function, I think, of how Syria continues to evolve. You're asking about the non-state actor piece. We discussed this earlier, not today, but in our correspondence. The way Syria is playing out is interesting. I don't think that there's clearly a sensitivity understood in this country, in other countries in the region, other places, sort of about the empowerment of non-state actors, conceivably at the expense of the state actors. And I think that how things are playing out in Syria has the potential maybe to change the paradigm. We don't know. I mean, it's still early. We see all kinds of countries on the borders of Syria making moves to insulate themselves against what could happen there. We've seen some positive signs out of the new Syria, but it's early to tell. There's a history and influences that could go in other directions. But, I would submit, certainly, in the American calculus, and not only, other countries as well, and we've seen the amount of engagement, that we've had with HTS right now in Damascus specifically and beyond. I think that, it's not so much viewed as taking a negative actor and putting them in charge as maybe the opportunity to reform an actor. In other words, not so much even in terms of, they probably will come into the mix as well, actual definable, metrics. But I think we do see a conversation about if they're able to walk the walk and talk the talk, then maybe they're not the people they were in the first place, in which case, we have a partner. Correct. Again, still early in that game. We don't know that. I think that, that most of us would, or all of us would prefer a situation where there was sort of a coordinated government address that controlled, the entire country, that was able to talk with and could be a responsible partner. We may end up there. We don't know that we're there yet. But that, that is a situation that will continue to evolve. In terms of, and this relates to, asked about the troops as well, how does that play out? I don't remember if it was in your question, but, there's obviously this overarching question of the Turkish role right now. Well, I'll fold some of it into this question. I mean, we saw, Trump's initial remarks, which were not surprising because, we know the actors we're dealing with, which were nominally impressed with, Erdogan, who, smart guy, he always wanted this, he did this. And I think that, by the way, dovetails with what we've seen in the other arenas that we discussed as well, with people sort of scrambling to try and, clean their desks before January 20th, so he's making his move now as well. The question becomes there too, how does this play out? I mean, if the Turkish role undermines, the Kurdish presence, and that all of a sudden creates a resurgence of ISIS, that has implications for all of us, certainly for the United States as well, right? So I think that, just like anything else, and I think someone used this line before, I find that for many months now, almost everything I say starts with, we have lots of questions and very few answers. I mean, there are lots of scenarios, lots of permutations here. It's still in play. I think we very much, to go back on everything that's been said, I think we know about sort of the most basic instincts of Trump himself, of the people around him, even though they're not all of the same ilk, and of the people, sort of the demographic that brought him to power. And those will be influencing decisions. But I think that because the reality is changing all the time, I mean, we're going to have to stay on our feet as well to see how those things continue to work themselves out.
So on the same front, recent media reports indicates to the possibility of removing HTS from the international terrorist list by Western actors, namely United States and the European Union. How might this change that would grant them official political roles in leading the governments in Syria influence the global context or the global terrorist landscape by encouraging other groups to adopt similar terror to power strategies as seen by leaders like Ahmed al-Shara today? And do you think Western powers or Western capitals recognize this concern that raises in the Middle East?
Sure, and I was touching on that. I think not only they recognize their concerns, I think they share them as well. But I think that, and again, we don't know how this will end up, but I think that it has all the makings of a test case in the sense that I don't think there's an actual interest here in sort of taking somebody who's on terrorist list and putting them in charge, right? The challenge right now is, okay, we're at this point in time now, right? And I think, and this, by the way, this, it affects everything that we think right now. I think we're all in a moment now where we're all trying to be modest on our predictions. We don't know. We've all been very surprised. I've told a number of people. I was in Doha last week, and at breakfast, my colleague turned to me and he said, "Who had Syria on their dance card for 2024?" I mean, this is an area of strategic surprises. Nobody saw that happening. The Israelis were surprised in October 2023. We have a lot of things that are happening. We don't necessarily know what would happen or how things would play out. I think that right now, what we're looking at in the Syrian situation with HTS, right, is that you have people coming in now saying, in many ways we are sort of breaking with our fundamentalist past. We want to govern this country differently. We've seen the messages And that, that's obviously, a lot of friction there on the border with the Israelis. But we've seen him say, Giuliani also say that, at this point, I think the Wall Street Journal, among other places, was reported where he said, we're not interested in you right now. You have no pretext to be in Syria because, we're not a problem for you. So there are all these things that are flying around. And if they are able to consolidate power and, sort of to turn into some sort of viable government and, blend into that sort of panorama of the region, then that would be one thing, right? But I don't think that it's a blank check. I think that if they sort of fail at that test, right, then that will be, that will be the lesson of that experiment as well. But I don't think the idea is here, like all of a sudden to take somebody with a past like that and say, keep doing what you've been doing before. We don't have a problem with that, right? The question is, will that change? If that changes, then conceivably the response of governments will be in accordance with that, and if not, then I think those those concerns are very well felt. I think people are still very wary about what could happen, but there's a moment of cautious optimism, if you will. There's obviously, on the one hand, there was the initial shock, but there seems to be broad satisfaction with the fact that Assad is out of power right now. This is a moment where something positive could happen. It doesn't guarantee that it will, but maybe there's that opportunity, and we can find a way to incentivize that. And if it doesn't, then to move in the other direction.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll move this question. Sorry, so I'll move this question to ask about the Abrahamic Accords to Dr. Janardhan specifically, and then I'll get back to you. President-elect Donald Trump considers the Abrahamic Accords as an achievement of his Middle East policy. Given the continuous implications of the 7th of October events and the consequences of the Assad's downfall, do you see other states in the region joining the Abrahamic Accords?
The short answer is no.
No.
Not in the immediate future. Because, you see, we must contextualize it in terms of whether Abraham Accords were popular or not even before October 7th. From the time it was signed, I think much of the Arab world was not in favor of Abraham Accords. And it was also, after Abraham Accords were signed, I think Israel definitely reneged on many of its commitments made in the Abraham Accords. And many of the people who have been observing the Abraham Accords and its development have been trying to find reasons why Abraham Accords still hold ground in one way or the other. That's largely because a lot of developments that took place after the Abraham Accords were signed are difficult to roll back. And we were talking about this in the IMEC conference workshop that we had at the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy along with AJC. We organized one last week. And we were trying to highlight the fact that it's not just Abraham Accords that are at play now. You have the I2U2 that came in after the Abraham Accords. You also have the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor that's part of, it's an fallout of the Abraham Accords. And so when you put all these things together, you can't just roll back Abraham Accords. And also just for the UAE, you can't reverse all the flights that you have now to Israel. You can't roll back on the Abrahamic family house. You can't roll back on all those kosher restaurants that have opened up here. You can't roll back on all the tourists who are going to and fro. All of this means that Abraham Accords is here to stay. Now, what about the future? I think the events of October 7th and after makes signatories to a difficult proposition. The option is definitely still on the table. I read Harter's report yesterday, which said that Saudi Arabia and Israel have some sort of an arrangement, and they've gotten very close to signing a normalization treaty. But we are not sure. There's a statement from the Arab side that nothing at all. So there has been this sort of one step forward and two steps backward over the last year. And I think Saudi Arabia at some point clearly mentioned that it's not going to take a decision until the next administration is in place. So we'll have to really wait and see how all that plays out. But the most important thing is for any country to sign the Abraham Accords moving forward, there has to be something that Israel has to give. It cannot be on the same terms. I'm very conscious that Israel will never accept a two-state solution at this point in time. I think they've made it very clear. The government and the parliament has voted against it. But if you are not going to have a two-state solution, there needs to be something else as a concession that Israel has to give for other Arab countries to be enticed, or as some sort of a bait for them to sign the Abraham Accords. I don't know what that would be. I'm sure that's where the negotiations will take place. And I really think the onus is on Israel, and only then will the other countries, especially Saudi Arabia, will be willing to compromise. Until Assad's fall, it appeared that Trump could somehow pull a rabbit out of the hat and, have some sort of a deal on this issue. But I think things have become that much more harder ever since there's been all the changes in Syria. And I think Trump also, basically, I'm not a U.S. political expert, but those who know U.S. politics better would understand. I think Trump has a 2-year window. His primary goal would be to try and ensure that the economy revs up in one form or the other, especially in terms of addressing the problems that Americans have been facing domestically. And if he can't do that adequately, then he's most likely, he and Republicans are most likely going to lose the midterm elections. And if that were to happen, he would already become a lame duck president to a large extent. And as a result, he wouldn't have the same sort of agency to go about insisting on other countries signing Abraham Accords. So I think that's where it all boils down to. And so in this case, I think it appears that neither the Twitter or the teleprompter Trump can help unless there are more shocking compromises on all sides. It involves compromises on all sides, but Israel has to make the first compromise.
Mr. Lipner, do you agree with what Dr. Janardhan mentioned?
So a couple of points on that and a couple of my own points. Just to make one point at the end that's tangentially related, but you were talking about the cycle. I think it's worth noting here too, more questions than answers. I think that normally your timeline is right in conventional terms. We may be in uncharted water. I don't know. What do I mean when I say that? Democratic Party is in disarray. The Trump wing of the Republican Party is ascendant. It's possible that, especially if there's no re-election, he could lose midterms, these things could happen. I don't think we have a full sense of the trajectory yet. So it's possible the spirit of Trump hovers over our government for longer than that as a result of that residual effect. I don't know, I'm just, as you said it, I had to process it. On the question of the Accords, I think your opening sentence was interesting because you said one thing and then you qualified it, and I think that's true. So, you had said that you didn't think the Accords would move, at least not immediately, and I think that's the kicker. In other words, I don't think that, maybe we've taken a step back because of current realities, but I think fundamentally, I also, as it relates, you're right to say that all these elements are in place. I would not necessarily so much say as that they can't be rolled back because all these things have happened. Certainly in the case of the UAE, and these were the statements coming out, there was a strategic decision to move down this course. And in the face of adversity, other things that happened in the region, maybe it's true they couldn't roll it back, but I think that the decision to stick with the Accords has been reaffirmed repeatedly. So it seems not so much like, well, what are we going to do? We're stuck with these things. We've decided to do this. We think it's beneficial for our position, and we're going to keep it going that way. So, maybe it's a mix. Maybe there are some things that well, how are we going to move that? But in other cases, there's been, affirmative statements coming out of Abu Dhabi and other places repeatedly that, that we knew what we were getting into when we signed on to the Accords. We didn't expect it to necessarily be clear sailing, but this is a relationship that's important, and we'd like to keep it going. And the Accords have proven robust. It's been a very difficult time. It has not escaped the notice of Israelis that when most foreign airlines have stopped flying to Israel, flights to the UAE continue almost unabated. This relationship has very much shown the test of this time. Look, Trump agreed, you said this as well, other people said this, Trump definitely views the Abraham Accords as his signature achievement. It's probably one of the few things that he did, despite, reservations that some quarters have had. we can discuss those. They're not really relevant to the conversation here, but for the most part, there's been very little opposition. It was generally carried bipartisan. Most countries in the region, even though they might have wished other things would happen at the same time that not necessarily did, were very much supportive of the idea. I think that, yes, the times are challenging right now, but indeed, not even just the report that you say you saw in Haaretz, but I mean, I think, you know, the statements that we've seen coming out of Saudi, you know, reported conversations, you know, the indication being, we think that the trajectory continues to be in the direction of signing on to those arrangements. You know, this may not be the time, it may be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, things may need to happen, but I don't think that there's been a decision to move away from that. The question is, again, to fall back on what you said, immediately, probably not immediately. The major questions are, first of all, what is the price of entry at the end of day? You know, originally it was thought before the Gaza war, the discourse was that Israel had to make some gesture in terms of opening a pathway towards a 2-state solution. Since the war, it's been said, no, it has to be a little more concrete and irreversible. The debate continues on what it actually would require, not require. So that's one piece of it. I think there's obviously a piece of the domestic Israeli debate as well, which, you know, there are plenty of spoilers there as well who, and I've been saying this since the beginning of that government, it hasn't really changed yet, even though Netanyahu himself is very committed to move this ball down the court. I think that there are people in his coalition who are not capable of paying even the most basic rhetorical price that would require for those things to move forward. So we haven't actually seen that kind of movement yet. On the other side of the equation, though, again, this is something that you know, the Prime Minister himself is interested in, that it appears that people, you know, influential people in Saudi government and other countries would like this to happen as well. Timing we can discuss in the actual dynamics. The American role is a factor here, even if we're only looking at 2 years of that, you know, sort of, you know, Trump in his prime, no matter what happens. You know, it stands to reason the president will get behind that strongly. He sent people to the region already to have these conversations. You know, there will be an effort to drive that ball. You know, then it comes into the space of to what extent do things move forward because people want to be on his good side. I mean, there is that, you know, there's the element of doing it because we want to do it for ourselves. And there's the element, you know, there's the broader calculus of, well, you know, maybe we have reservations, but it's right now more important to sort of line up with Trump and move certain, you know, move things that we might not otherwise have moved. It's a question how all those pieces necessarily fit together. And of course, you know, all this happens against a backdrop of all kinds of strategic changes in the region. You know, we've seen what happened in Lebanon. We've seen what's happened in Syria. You know, Iran is arguably on the defensive, not vanquished, but, you know, clearly sort of licking its wounds to some extent. That sort of, you know, affects one half of the equation, and the other people that are, you know, the traditional partners of Pax Americana will be looking at this as well and say, you know, maybe that requires us to sort of coalesce around something as well, you know, what the price would be, what it wouldn't be, whether Israel does or doesn't make a move, whether or not that actually holds enough, those things will be in play. But I don't think there's any doubt that, you know, that just the concept of expanding the accords is going to be front and center of a Trump agenda.
Thank you for this answer. Dr. Janardhan tied the future of the Abrahamic Accords to the 2-state solution, and what kind of offer would Israel present to the Arab world. In this note, Brian Hook, who will be expected to lead the State Department transition team in Donald Trump administration, stated that the deal of the century will be back on the table. However, he mentioned that nobody in the mood to discuss 2-state solution following Hamas's attack. In light of this changing context in the aftermath of October the 7th, what is the future of the peace process? Will the future deal resemble what has been named the deal of the century? This question is for you both, but I'll start with you, Mr. Lipner, and then Dr. Janardhan.
So for obvious reasons, you know, I'm hesitant to speak about, you know, actual solutions right now. Like you said, after October 7th, that's just not the phase we're in. We'll get there. Don't worry. Don't worry. I heard. I mean, right now there's a little constituency for like that kind of talk. You know, I mean, in fact, we've seen not enough of a discussion of the day after, much less of, you know, longer term. Trump made an interesting statement early on, the first time around, which everybody, I have a counterintuitive view of that. I don't remember the exact quote, but he sort of said something about, one state, two states, whatever it is, and everybody sort of mocked, like, what's he talking about? He doesn't know what he's talking about. I mean, I think that probably underlying that was a sentiment of anything that the parties can agree on, I'm happy to lay my hands on, which fits with, essentially his thinking in the entire region, right? It's like, I don't want any more wars, I don't want conflict, I want people to have these, great agreements, and I want to be able to say that it was because of me. So I think, he's plenty happy for things to necessarily work out that way. In terms of the deal itself, I mean, it's hard to see how we're looking at the same parameters. I mean, I can't speak for Brian, but presumably what he meant is we'll be back in the era where we'll be looking to do a deal. Would it, be that exact deal as last time? I don't know. I mean, look, we have to take into account a number of things. First of all, the team that wrote the deal of the century is not coming back. The specific people, the individuals, right? I mean, a lot of them will still be in Trump's orbit, but there are a whole new cast of people that are running the Middle East shops right now. Will those be their ideas? Will they be looking at different ideas? Realities have changed. How do they do that? I think it discounts the fact that at the end of the day, I mean, everybody hated the deal. Everybody. I mean, essentially, people thought that everybody thought that they knew who liked it, right? But the Palestinians hated it because it didn't give them their path. The settler leaders got up and said that it actually endangers the existence of the state of Israel because it actually did foresee some sort of Palestinian state down the road. So even something that that people thought like, oh, this is something that's in place and makes some people happy and it'll drive it kind of got stuck there as well. There was confusion about its specifics as well. I don't know if we all remember. Well, there are two pieces of that down. The first thing is that I think that there were people in Israel who took an expansive view of what it implied. That at the end we can review the history, but there were all kinds of discussions inside the White House, and people were saying like, no, we didn't necessarily think you were going to do this. We didn't agree to that. It wasn't as like cut and dry as people thought. So there was that whole sort of discord going on as well. It wasn't like there was this deal and it did or didn't. And ultimately, I think if we have to, who better than the people here know this? At the end of the day, the deal was swapped out for the Accords, essentially, in terms of how the things played out. There was this deal. In the end, because how things evolved, and then there was a discussion coming to the UAE. It's like, well, if we put annexation in a box, then we can move forward on the Abraham Accords. Instead, we ended up somewhere different. So it's if anything, if we look at the last experience of the deal of the century, there are all kinds of factors indicating it may not necessarily play out the same way as it did last time. Where does that leave us? Possibly for all of its the fact that it's less than optimistic. I mean, maybe a version of the variation of what we see now. I mean, it may be something that requires sort of generational leadership change to be able to move down that right now. But I think that, to go back to Trump's one state, two states, I mean, I think it's an open question. I mean, there is certainly an orthodoxy in terms of like that's the solution on the table, let's move towards it. On the other hand, we all have to recognize the reality that right now it's not particularly viable. Where does that leave that? I think it's an open question right now.
Dr. Janardhan, how do you envision the two-state solution and the peace of, and the deal of the century?
I think after October 7th, any deal would be the deal of the century, right? I mean, the starting point, just in terms of getting a ceasefire, could be the deal of the century. I mean, because I think you've seen far too much of devastation and deaths and acrimony. This needs to end. So the first deal of this century would be just getting a ceasefire. Thereafter, we'll see what comes out. But I think the larger question would be, how much longer are we going to continue this, violence, this hatred, and this status quo, if you want to call it, 75 years, and yet we haven't seen any sort of settlement to this Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I read somewhere that perhaps all the wars associated with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has made this region have perhaps the highest per capita wars in the world, just in terms of the war on terror being an offshoot of this and everything else that has gone on with the Arab-Israeli conflicts and all of this. So this definitely needs to end, either through the combined will of the forces that are the source of the problem, or through a combination of new forces. I mean, what is the ideal situation? Is the United States an enabler in this whole process? Is it facilitating? Is it attempting to bring about a solution? Or is it the cause of the problem in some sense? Can we leave it just to the Israelis and the Palestinians to manage this conflict? I'm not sure. You being there or anyone who is there knows it better. But is the United States actually being more constructive than otherwise? That's a question we need to ask too. And so sometimes I really wonder is how much longer are we going to continue looking at just the Western powers being the mediators in the conflict? Times have changed. The economies of the East are growing. Can they be some sort of a facilitators? Can the United States in some sense bring in new players into the fold? Can they become part of the mediation process in one sense? I'm not too sure, because I often think, and I think there is enough literature now, even from the United States, where people are recognizing that as long as the United States is the only mediator in the region, only security guarantor in the region, there's never ever going to be peace.
Are you encouraging other great actors to come and
Absolutely. I
engage in
think
the
you
region?
need to widen the scope of players in the region, especially in the context of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, because I think there are honest peace brokers, especially from the Asian side. When you take in China, Japan, South Korea, and India, for example, they are equidistant on both sides.
But the thing is, sorry for interrupting.
No, go ahead.
But the thing is, we didn't see China playing a role in what happened post-October the 7th.
That's because China doesn't want to come and solve a problem that somebody else has created. Why should China come in now and do what it has to do? It is going to wait until the United States digs its own grave to a large extent. So it will wait. The more the problem continues, the more the United States gets exposed as an incapable player. That must be China's game plan. Mm-hmm. It doesn't want to come and put out a fire that was started by someone else. So I think there is a strategy in that. Or they have not been even called to the table to come and do anything. Well, if you want to look at China's contribution in another sense, isn't the reconciliation that it brought about between Saudi Arabia and Iran in some way a contribution to peace in the region? Because you now at least have Iran in some way behaving a lot better than it would have behaved had it not been for that reconciliation. Whatever, pressure tactics, trade incentives, investment incentives, all of those things made Iran behave a lot better in the last 1 year than it would have had it not been for pressure from China and Saudi Arabia. So China has played a very important role in terms of going about reconciliation between Turkey and UAE, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, UAE and Iran, or UAE, not because it is wanting to do good to the region, that may be a bonus, but as a matter of fact, the Belt and Road Initiative, if it needs to achieve success, this region needs to be stable. So China has played a conflict management sort of role rather than a conflict resolution sort of role that the United States has always sought to go about doing things. And I think the onus is really on the United States. If the United States wants peace, it needs to enlarge the stakeholders. It needs to bring in new players. And I think this is also something associated with what we started off, the collective security architecture. I don't think the United States can continue to be the policeman of the world. Domestic politics doesn't allow it, resources doesn't allow it, and I think its own capacity doesn't allow it to be the only security guarantor in the region or anywhere in the world. And it would be much better if it brought in other players, encourage formation of other collective security mechanisms, alternate collective security mechanisms. And I think that's the only way forward. And I think most of the GCC leaders have also made official statements in the last 10 years wherein they have said that the politics of the region, the security of the region cannot be managed by just one country. You need to have a wider basket of countries. So I think that's where we need to link up all the things that we talk about in terms of economic diversification, in terms of foreign policy diversification, and that linking up with security diversification.
Okay, thank you. My last question is still discussing deals, but a different kind of deal. In his first term as the President of the United States, Trump adopted a hardline approach towards Iran. Yet there was a noticeable change of tone during his 2024 presidential campaign, stating his readiness to discuss a nuclear deal with Iran. Fast forward, Brian Hook stated that Trump plans to isolate and weaken Iran. Given these contradictory signals, how will the Trump administration approach Iran? Are we going to see a move towards diplomacy and possibility of a nuclear deal? Or will we witness another term of a tougher maximum pressure on Iran? What's your take on that, Dr. Janardhan?
I'm embarrassed to talk about Iran when Dr. Sultan is sitting here. He's an Iran expert, but let me give it my shot. I think the real difference between Trump 1.0 and 2.0 would be how he approaches Iran. It's far more complicated than Abraham Accords in that sense of the term. But during 1.0, Trump was completely anti-Iran. And that was when Iran was relatively stronger on all fronts. Today, Trump 2.0 is still a bit of a Alfred Hitchcock sort of mystery, because Iran now is far more weaker, especially so in the last few months. So it's likely that Trump would first follow a hawkish policy and then perhaps a dovish one. But certainly no war. I think he and his vice president-elect have made that very clear in some form, especially the vice president-elect. And we've seen some backroom operations, you referred to it, just in terms of Musk being out there. We've heard or read some reports in terms of how Elon Musk has been meeting or met the Iranian permanent representative in the UN. And so all that adds a bit of optimism. So is it going to be maximum pressure, or is it going to be maximum diplomacy? That's the question. Is it going to be a carrot sort of policy, or is it going to be a carrot and stick policy? I think for starters, as I mentioned, it'll be the stick sort of policy, because there would be immense pressure from Israel on the United States to ensure that Iran is not left off the hook. But I think the carrots would come from pressure from the GCC countries, because Trump 2.0 needs to recognize that there's been a great deal of reconciliation that has taken place. We already referred to it. Saudi Iran, UAE Iran, even Bahrain could soon restore diplomatic ties with Iran. We've been reading some reports about it. There have been Saudi Iran and Oman Iran naval exercises just last month. So all of these things, and even UAE Iran trade is back to its friction times. So we really are at a crossroad, and all of this means that a combination of all that has transpired with Iran's proxies getting a severe beating in recent months may force it to strike a deal with Trump, who would be looking for a breakthrough on the Palestinian issue. I think there would be some sort of a link between how Trump approaches Iran and what Iran can offer in terms of facilitating a deal on the Palestinian-Israeli issue, is what I think could happen. And if it indeed works out that way, why not? I mean, I think Trump would buy it. Iran would happy to make those compromises, and Israel will also get a way out to ensure that it can get a ceasefire.
Mr. Lipner, with a weaker Iran and a defeated Iranian proxies, do you think Trump would pursue with his maximum pressure, or is it an opportunity to go back to diplomacy and contain Iran?
Well, I think Dr. Janardhan is right that at the end of the day, this is multidimensional chess, right? There are a lot of things in play. It'd be interesting to see if they're the components of a broader deal. Look, I think that this is case in point that I was talking about paradoxes. We have the experience of the last time around where he was quick to get out of the JCPOA. But now we have reality where Iran is further on the path to a nuclear weapon than it was when it started in the first place, because nothing took its place. Now we have on the one hand maximum pressure. On the other hand, we have in September he says I want to do a deal. We have the Musk meetings, which he said I don't know anything about those. Did they happen? Nobody told me. I don't know. Part of it is that this sort of fog. Part of it is a lack of discipline. Part of it is not making a commitment in any way right now because it's early. Because why do it if you don't need to? Look, we've referenced this. The landscape has changed drastically. On the one hand, it's sort of scaled up. For the first time, we had open conflict between Israel and Iran. That seems to have taken its toll. It was always sitting around like everyone's promising response to a response to a response, which we haven't seen the next domino fall yet. Maybe it won't now. Maybe the advent of Trump creates an opportunity along the lines that were discussed. We don't know. Are the Iranians inclined, having looked at the damage that their axis sustained, to sort of move towards reconciliation, or do they, as the arguments have also been made at the same time, on the other hand, say this only under reinforces our thinking that we have to actually move quicker for a bomb as a result of that right now. Those decisions still need to be made there. I don't think there's no doubt, following the discourse in Israel, it's never been louder, people saying this is the opportunity to do something about it. How does that fit in with Trump's no more war, wanting quiet? It's a question. I mean, would Trump, so I think that when there was, there has been historically talk in Israel about whether or not Israel could take on the nuclear program itself or not. I mean, I've always suggested that that's sort of a simplistic way to look at it anyway, because even if that capacity existed, there would be a day after in which other, allies would be required. We certainly saw, not the second time, but after the first missile strike, all these countries that, aligned under the rubric of CENTCOM essentially to go ahead and stop the Iranian strike. So this isn't something that, it's not a one-off. It doesn't happen just by one thing Israel does. It doesn't do by itself. Is there support for something they would do in the second phase? Would there be, support for that now? The noise has never been louder. Past administrations, future administrations have all committed to make sure that Iran never reaches a position where it achieves a nuclear bomb. Will they actually put their money where their mouth is? There's been skepticism before. I think that people have never been as inclined as now to think maybe something could happen, but I think we're just going to have to keep reading those tea leaves. I don't think we know right now. It's in terms of Trump, I think we can say broadly, and this isn't just about him. This will be for anybody in the position that he's in right now. It's very easy to be president before January 20th, when all you have to do is talk. When you actually have to go ahead and run the country and make policy and suffer the consequences of mistakes, that encourages conceivably a different kind of behavior. So I think we're all going to be watching.
This has been a great and insightful conversation, but unfortunately, we have reached the end of this symposium. I express my gratitude to the guest speaker and to you, audience, and we are looking forward for you to join our future events here at the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research. Thank you very much.